All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll go ahead and get us started here. It's my great privilege today to introduce Matt Christensen. He's going to be talking about a really neat project that he was involved with on the replacement of the Dale Street Bridge over I-94 in St. Paul. And one of the areas that I think is going to be really neat that he's going to talk about is their approach, the team's approach to community engagement and collaboration with community members, artists, and local businesses on this project. Matt is currently the Vice President of the Surface Transportation Division at TKDA, which is based in St. Paul, and he's been there for his entire career. He's been there 23 years. He's got extensive experience in highway, pedestrian, and railroad bridge design. He's worked on a variety of bridge projects. And before he was a vice president for the Surface Transportation Division, he was actually managing the bridge group. And he's one of our great alumni. So our alumnuses, I guess alumni, I'll just stick with that one. He got both his bachelor's and master's here at U of M with a structural engineering emphasis. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much for taking the time to come.
Get this clipped in. All right, thank you for having me here today. I'm pretty excited to come back to the U where I spent a lot of time in this room. To be perfectly honest, and fun fact, I met my wife like in the third row back there in the soil mechanics class. So it was good for me in many different ways. St. Paul was my stomping grounds when I was a kid. You know, kind of running around in my youth, you would learn about the Rondo neighborhood and the story of what happened. And to be perfectly honest, when this project came, across my desk, of course, it piqued my interest. This is obviously where I call home. But also one of the things I really like about a transportation project, one of the things I find really beneficial is that you get to kind of leave your fingerprint on your community for longer than you're going to be around, right? The bridges have a design life of 75 years. To be perfectly honest, they'll probably last longer than that because they need to. But I was really interested in this. And not only that, just from, this is where I grew up, but Rondo, it has such an importance in St. Paul and largely due to the community there that kept the story, in the news. But so I was pretty interested, but to be perfectly honest, what I thought I knew at the time when I started the project is not at all the full story, obviously. So this is a project that was really devised by the Ramsey County was the lead. And to be perfectly frank, I mean, we've all driven down 94. They're all tight diamond interchanges, right? The ramps are really tight to the bridges, and a lot of them are functionally not operating very well. And this was a major one that the county wanted to replace. So the bridge was fine, but functionally it didn't work very well. So Ramsey County read the project, obviously in St. Paul, they'd be involved. MnDOT would be involved as they're actually the owner of the bridge. Of course, we had to deal with the neighborhood groups. So there's two of them, Rondo Avenue Inc. and Summit University. Blue Cross Blue Shield was involved. They donated some time and money to the project. And then Springboard for the Arts, which is a nonprofit for artists. And I'll get into why they ended up being part of the project. Like I said, scope of the project was really just to make that crossing and the signals more functionally operate better. That was originally the intent of the project. You would add some lighting, but in the end, what we ended up doing is we really tried to create a better environment for pedestrians and then also for mass transit and things like that. When the county looks at their priorities of what are we going to try and design to? What is our priority in terms of the design priority? It's pedestrians, it's bicycles, then it goes to mass transit, then it goes to vehicles, and then it goes to, freight traffic, basically trucks. So as such, we needed to improve the pedestrian environment here. So what really is unique about this project, and when we got into it, I won the job with county, put the RFP out in September of 15, proposed on it. We were successful in winning the job. And so then we got into starting off the public engagement part. And this part of a project, public engagement, has changed drastically over my career, even from when the original bridge was constructed. In a way, when it started, it was not so much check a box, but you would have your project and then you'd have a couple meetings. You would get a church basement or a community center. You'd put a layout up, you get some poster boards up, folks would come in, and they'd give you some comments. And then you would take those into consideration, and you'd do it a couple times. You'd do it initially when the project was starting, just to get some initial feedback. You would then come back later, once you've gotten that feedback, and put some layouts together, multiple, and then you get feedback on that. And then ultimately you'd present, on the third one, what you were going to do in the project. In the first one, we did just that. We went in, we put a layout of a concept down, and I'll show you in a little bit what that looked like. But the feedback we got pretty quickly was, you need to slow way down. We're not ready to even start talking about options here. We need to just start talking. And so then that was an eye-opener for us. And so we put the pause button on project development. That just sat on the side. And then you can kind of see some dates there. 16, 17, 18, 19, we had open houses. We would start going to Rondo Days, which is a big community event in the neighborhood there. And then we'd do one-on-ones. We'd go meet at people's houses, like a smaller neighborhood group, for a street or something. We go into their house and just start talking. And then eventually what we started doing was design charrettes. What do you want to see? What elements or what features of this project are you most interested in seeing? And some of that is really difficult, right, for someone to express, because, we're transportation professionals. We kind of know all the various things you can do reasonably. But they may not be as familiar, but they know kind of what they'd want to see. That bridge that was there had multiple lanes. And like I said, it was a tight diamond. So it was really tight, right? And we've all been in intersections like this where people run the reds, or they kind of keep flowing through. There's call it a hill, but because of the way the grade crossing was, there was a steep grade down to the north as Dale went to the north, actually a bit above 8%. And if you're familiar with ADA requirements, the max grade is 5%. And you think 3 or 5 to 8, that's a 3% delta. That's not that much. It is quite a bit, especially if you're in a wheelchair, or if you're older and, you're trying to negotiate walking down a steep slope, especially in the winter. So when we started having these meetings, we got a lot of this feedback, right? We want a better pedestrian crossing. We want it to be more open. The current bridge had 5-foot sidewalks. It was built at the dawn of the interstate, and back then it was really a utility. You need to get across the bridge, 5 feet's enough, good for everyone, right? And so they wanted a wider sidewalk, but sidewalks at the time when we started this project, the biggest we'd ever build would be 12 feet. And that kind of came around when I started my career in the 2000s, and that was a big deal to go from 8 to 12 feet. They wanted bigger than 12. Oh, okay. And I think we've all heard of the lid that they're talking about. They brought that up, but everyone recognizes that didn't fit within this project. That was something else, but they liked the concept of space. So that was one of the things. So you can see kind of the feedback summary here. And one of the things that came out too was they wanted something unique about the bridge. They wanted, and they couldn't put their finger on it, but essentially somehow draw our neighborhood into the aesthetics of the bridge, our history into the aesthetic of the bridge. I'm a bridge engineer. I'm not an artist. I don't have that sort of creative mind. All of the folks I was working with at the county, right, they are engineers too. So, you know, we put a lot of thought into that. And what we ended up doing was reaching out to an organization that works with artists. And what they do is they're a nonprofit. They need to get some seed funding, but they can connect artists with projects, and it can be transportation projects, it can be industrial, it can be if you're an ecolab and you're looking to do something with your space, they can help you find an artist, right? It's just something to help get artists into some sort of field of work. And so what we did is we worked with Springboard for the Arts, and we interviewed 12 different artists. So St. Paul put in $10,000, Ramsey County put in $10,000, and Blue Cross Blue Shield put in $10,000 too. So we had $30,000 that we could use to hire some artists. And initially we weren't sure what we were going to do. Were we going to hire one? Were we going to hire multiple? We didn't know. So we did some interviews. We put out applications. The nonprofit reached out to artists, 12 applied. We went in, we listened to their what they proposed. And ultimately we came up with these three here, Micah, GE, and Howana. And what was fundamentally successful about this is that all of these artists have roots in the neighborhood, right? There's a lot of distrust in this area from the past. They don't care if you're Ramsey County or a consultant or City of St. Paul or MnDOT. You're still just building a project in our area, right? It doesn't matter. And what we needed to do was to gain the trust of the neighborhood. We needed to move our project along, but we needed buy-in from the neighborhood that we could move this along. And so we worked with these three here, and they had no transportation background in them. They have plenty of work that they have done, both commercially and on their own. They all have different mediums of work. So some are, I think Micah works a lot with mosaic tiles. GE has a couple different mediums, and then Howana is a poet. And so honestly, I wasn't sure what we were going to get into or how we were going to pull this off, but this is who we were going to start working with and collaborating with. Meanwhile, just keep in mind, we haven't done a lot on the project yet. So what did they do? They helped us engage with the community more than what we have done in the past. And so they went to Rondo Days and other events in the neighborhood, and they had some great reach outs. And they did these booths, and they would have chalkboards and whiteboards, and they'd say, what do you kind of make it a general statement. What do you want to see? What makes you happy in the area? Just asking some questions. And so these, are the people that engage, and they take pictures of everyone so that they would document not only who wrote it, but, what their thoughts were regarding the project. And this went on for a long time. And eventually what ended up happening is they started to come up with some design concepts for me to try and consider on how to wrap it into a transportation project. So Rondo Inc. This is an organization, a nonprofit of the neighborhood group. It's headed by Marvin Anderson. He was his childhood neighborhood here was before 94. And so he had this poster at a lot of our engagement meetings. And what this shows is where 94 obviously went through the neighborhood. You can see that by the lighter line that went through, and the neighborhood, how it was before. And what's significant about Rondo, I mean, we went at the time, these interstates went through a lot of different neighborhoods. What it did when it went through Dale is Dale was the center of the African-American neighborhood in Rondo. It was their kind of their downtown, if you will, for their neighborhood. They had some shops there. They had some gathering places there. And this really this project really bisected that whole thing, kind of wiped it all away. And for those that don't know, the 94 had two corridors as an option. Obviously, the one that they built on, but the other one was more up by Energy Park Drive, which was more commercial, right? Industrial, had different economic value in the minds of those that made this decision. And so, but 94 went right through the neighborhood. So if you just take a look at what this map is, right? It's a grid of a neighborhood, and 94 went through it. And this was pretty significant. If you took the time to talk to Marvin about it, read all these different points that he has identified on here, you get a better vision of, what happened and how it was so deeply hurtful to those that called that home. And so the artist really wanted to pull this into the project. And so they came up with this. And they said, we'd like this on the bridge somehow. And I'm like, all right, well, we could probably do that. And what you see now, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, but when you drive under Dale, there's treatments that we do to concrete, right? Formliner, everyone here I think is probably pretty familiar with that. We went and talked to a formliner supplier. We brought this image in. You can't do a formliner where you have individual squares. What they were looking for was like a 3D nature to this, right? Where either the streets were inset or the neighborhood blocks, if you will, were inset. But somehow, if this was 0, this would be -1 inch type thing. We went to a formliner supplier down on West 7th Street in St. Paul and talked it through. And there's a way that they could make this out of a plastic-like material with a CNC machine. That seemed pretty reasonable. And so what we did with this is we nailed it to the inside forms of the abutment, right? The end of the bridge is the abutment. There's a large face of concrete there. And so what you see when you go through there now is this on the face of the abutment. They originally wanted one to be streets as the negative inset, and then on the other abutment, streets be the outset. And the idea there was that they could come together and lock together. Cost-wise, couldn't do that. And the artists were incredibly good because they had these ideas. I had to get it into a form that 1 was constructible, and 2, economic, and 3, you can't call it art because federal money can't pay for art. So it had to really be aesthetics. So at any rate, save on money. We made 1 form and we reused it everywhere. But when we were done with the job and we were doing the grand opening, some neighborhood folks were there and they were looking at it and they're like, is that the map of the neighborhood? And I said, yes, it is. So, bringing these elements into it. This is our neighborhood. Yes, 94 went through it, but this is our crossing was kind of the emphasis there. Other concepts they gave me, we'll go over this a little bit, but I got a pointer here. They wanted some language imprinted into the barrier. And then the big one here that they wanted a house and some pilasters, and then there's the tree, which was an interesting one. So here's another view of that. And what they wanted with the tree, they wanted metal trees, and they wanted them to represent like when you drive down a street in a neighborhood, there's a canopy of trees. They wanted to, artistically or give the impression of 94 having the canopy of trees over it. And then again, bringing the 2 sides back together. I said, how tall are we thinking for these trees? And they said 40 feet. And I said, well, we got to scale that down a little bit. So eventually we landed on around 18, 20 feet, which I said, well, why don't we go for the height of a street light and then figure out from there. And I still didn't know what we were going to do to make that happen. But nonetheless, that was a pretty neat concept, I thought. And so they were giving me these ideas here. Here's a kind of another look at it when we put it into CAD. But one, how do we do this? How do we pay for it? And how do I try and make it constructible? was a big part of the work we had to do. Another thing that they wanted to do is We Are Rondo. So when they were doing those that engagement with the neighborhood folks, they kept talking about their neighborhood. We are Rondo. This is our neighborhood. You can put a freeway through it, but it's still ours. And so they wanted somehow We Are Rondo into the railing. Okay. When we were looking at that, I mean, you initially look at that and you go, well, if that's going to be cut out of steel, the E's don't work, the A doesn't work, the O doesn't work, right? You got all these, that's the eye I was going to with it was, okay, well, how do I do this? So nonetheless, that was the challenge there. And then they wanted to do these leaves, oak leaves, again, with the trees, making it as if the rebirth of the area, right? And so if you look at that from a constructability point of view, we have some challenges on how that would work. You could see a kid coming up and just pulling on that and bending that piece of metal out, and then we got a problem. So that is, but that's the concept I have to work with. Down here, I have another slide for this later, but what that is We Are Rondo, I Am Rondo, written in 13 different languages. And the 13 different languages represent the 13 different ethnic groups that call Rondo home right now. So that's pretty cool. I like that idea. Probably could do something with Formliner and CNC to make that happen. Not entirely sure. Could get expensive, but I like the idea of it. They wanted to do houses. And so what they were looking at was neighborhood houses. They went around and took pictures of some houses, and they wanted to put houses on the bridge to represent the houses that were there, basically reclaiming their stake that this is my plot of land. This is where I called home. So we literally got, some images like that, some concepts, and some pictures of bridges or of houses that we were to implement into the bridge. Okay. Again, I really liked the concept, but wasn't entirely sure how we were going to do that just yet. And like I said, one of the artists, is a poet. And she wanted to write a poem that would get placed into the sidewalk of the bridge. And the way she wrote the poem was that depending on what direction you were walking, you could read the poem from both directions. And it kind of had a different meaning. And so literally this poem right here is the inverse of that one right there. An incredibly cool idea. As I'm sure a lot of folks here know, MnDOT is particularly sensitive about their bridge decks and putting any sort of imperfection into it, and that impacting the life of the bridge. But nonetheless, okay, we'll see what we can do with this and where we can put it. But I thought it was a pretty interesting idea. The dance of the Lindy Hop was a dance that was significant in the African-American community back in the day in particular. And it has this step pattern that I cannot do. But nonetheless, they came up with that, and with these leaves, using leaves to signify one leaf type is left foot, one is the right foot. And they wanted this to be included somehow into the bridge. And then here is the image I got for the I Am Rondo, written in 13 different languages, of which I'm only good at one of them. And if we were going to put this into concrete, I had to make sure they were all correct. So what did we do with this? They had all these concepts, none of them on the face of it really all that constructible, and arguably almost all of it art, which runs into federal money funding problems. So we spent, I want to say, a better part of a year at the St. Paul Public Library at the corner of University and Dale, right by where the light rail is. taking these concepts and then we'd put them into engineering, right? We'd put them into CAD, we'd put some details together, and ultimately work towards a solution that is constructible. So a lot of these things, like the I am Rondo in 13 different languages, we did a formliners. We found a company that could basically a thin sheet of plastic, punch the letters into it, right? So to give it some depth, and that would get nailed onto the inside of the form. So that's how we did the 13 different languages. I'll just go back. And so this would just get inset into the form, and then that's how it was placed. So that worked out pretty well. Regarding the 13 different languages, we hired outside, sorry, I'm losing my words here, but translators to help us make sure that it is all accurately correct. And so you got to find people that are experts in 13 different languages, but we went through that effort. These right here, and including the poem, there's a lot of detail here, right? Like they got the spine of the leaf with kind of the veins of the leaf going out. Obviously couldn't do any of that, but we did the outside image. What we ended up doing is 3M has this product that you can cut out with a CNC, lay it on the concrete, and then someone comes through with a sandblast and blast it into the concrete. Obviously, that's a one-time opportunity, right? If you're sandblasting. And so we had some panels poured off to the side that we were going to demo later. But we laid these out, and the laborers, I'll just back up really quickly. This project was incredibly rewarding to work on for a number of different people. The laborers included. It was different work, right? It was unique, again, for the same reasons that I love transportation projects. Sorry, the mic. They like this as well. And so they sandblasted it. They spent time trying to make sure they were doing it right, but the form is only good one time. So they had rolls of this stuff for doing these leaves. Got to figure it out. And so in the approach panels, which is the concrete segment of pavement prior to the actual bridge, in the sidewalk area are the leaves doing the Lindy Hop. And then for the poem on the bridge deck, this was a pretty neat experience. MnDOT's incredibly sensitive about their bridge decks. They don't last very long. Our environment is really tough on them. And so we want to try and keep them as, pristine as possible. And when I'm talking to the bridge office about, well, I want to put in a poem on the bridge deck, and I think we can sandblast it. And they were remarkably good to work with on that. And what we ended up doing is we ended up using an internal cure concrete mix. The University of Kansas or Kansas State, I don't know if you know which one. Yeah, they were really, they were working with MnDOT a lot on this mix, and MnDOT had used it on 2 projects before, one where it went well, one where it didn't go as good. But they wanted to give it another try. They felt like that mix and would deliver the resilience of the deck that they were looking for, yet allow us to do the sandblasting. As I'm sure a lot of you know now, we put a lot of fibers in concrete now, and we put that into the bridge decks, and they really do an amazing job of producing a great bridge deck, but they're fuzzy when they're done, right? You got all the fibers, those wear off, but it wouldn't allow sandblasting. That wouldn't work out. They'd interfere with that. And so we did this internal cure mix. I was involved during construction. I was the construction administrator, and we brought the university up, the folks at the university that were working on the mix. We did a pre-pour. We talked about all the different variables. I'm sure you know it is a very sensitive mix. You can't just add water like a lot of contractors like to do to make it easier to work with. And we had to do the bridge construction in stages, half at a time. It turned out fantastic. MnDOT, of the 3 they had done to date, this one was the absolute best bridge deck pour they had for this mix. So that was one thing that MnDOT brought to the table, and we worked with them on. But as far as the poem goes, same thing. We had a really wide sidewalk. The letters on the text were about 1 foot tall. and we laid it all out onto the bridge deck, and basically the laborers got a one-time shot at it. That was it. There's no more. And it turned out remarkably well. For the houses, we created in our office, basically 3D renderings of it, the face of it, 2 inches deep. And then in the plans, we put a note in there that the CAD file for that would be available to the contractor during construction. They took that, gave it to a supplier, and they, out of basically styrofoam, high density, they did the inverse of it. And that got set into the form. I'll get into the trees a little bit on how I pulled that off and some of the other attributes. But nonetheless, for like a year, we spent a lot of time going back and forth, and we do community engagement meetings along the way. And that proved to be enormously successful. Pulling the community in via the artists, making sure that they had a voice into what this project looked like was fundamentally key to the success of the job. And when you're delivering a project now, a transportation project, especially in an urban area, that part of the project delivery is rapidly changing and is becoming a more central focus of the project than actually the engineering part. A 2-span pre-stressed beam bridge is no big deal. We do these all the time. It's bread and butter. The roadway design and all that, you know, largely following AASHTO guidelines. So the engineering part of a project like this is pretty simple, straightforward. It's how you engage the community, how you go out to get their trust, and how you bring what they want into the project, yet still make it constructible and within a level of budget. That part is going to become more and more dominant in projects. So a little bit about the project scope. This was what was in the proposal. When you send something out to engineers for a proposal, you got to give them something to put a number to. It's a little longer than you might think, but the sole focus was replacing the bridge and adding a turn lane. There was width in the median to the north, so that didn't need to go very far, but we had to widen out to the south to make room for that. So that's essentially the whole reason why the project is what it is. It's replace the bridge, add a turn lane, tie it in as quick as possible. Well, we started doing community engagement meetings. And one of the things that we did too, when we did the engagement, is they'd say, we want a better pedestrian crossing. We don't like being mixed in with traffic. Fair. They see all sorts of crossings where PEDs are separated, and that, you know, is attractive. One of the things we did in a community engagement meeting was in the basement of a church. I spent the whole night doing it. Is we went down each of those paths with them. They said, I want to separate the pedestrians from the traffic. Okay, for this crossing, what does that look like? And we brought drawings in and we showed them how the PEDs would have to be in a bridge up and over the other bridge and how they would tie in. Or you could go underneath, you know, the frontage roads on each side with box culverts and a tunnel, and you got to get down to the tunnel. And we went through all that. You know, it's easy for a design professional to just say, you know, that's not really all that possible. That's not practical. But they're not going to necessarily see it as simply as you do. But to have them come to the same conclusion we did, we went down that road. And at the end of it, actually, Setu Jones, who's a figure in the neighborhood and an artist in the transportation world, was quite appreciative of it because it did help bring everyone into the same conclusion. Ultimately, what we wanted was the bridge that we were proposing, but way better pedestrian accommodations. And initially we thought, just throwing a number out there, it could be 30 feet wide for the PED area. Obviously, that's not very cost effective. That's going to be really expensive and an enormously wide bridge. But we kept that going, and we parred through some different options. Tiger Jack, I don't know if anyone knows the name. This, when my dad was a kid, this right here used to be a little shop in the Dale neighborhood. You can go in there and get candy as a kid, or a soda, some ice cream. The building that's there now is not the original. That's actually at the Minnesota Historical Society. But nonetheless, we were trying to pull away from that building because as you can see right now, the sidewalk and roadway are basically right on it to create some more space. So we were trying to look at, changing the alignment a little bit, but still keeping the bridge wide. And then we're like, oh, well, the neighborhood would like better accommodations down here. This is what happens on a transportation project, by the way. You don't know where to start. Easy to spend money when you're actually not spending it yet. But we want to make this better down here. And by the way, green's an overlay, yellow is a reconstruct. So we're just gonna overlay this, kind of give it a new face. And then you'll start seeing this type of stuff right here. Transportation projects nowadays, you have to treat stormwater. You can't just dump it into the river. You got to treat it. You got to pull the solids out, try and make it as clean as possible when it goes on the river. So now we start talking no place for ponds. So large pipes underground that can act as a pond, allow it to infiltrate into the ground. Meanwhile, we're still tying in as soon as we can on the north, but we're doing sidewalks to the north, making some improvements down that way. Oh, and then right here, we bought an old gasoline. There was a gasoline station there, a gas station, and that had gone out of business. The county saw an opportunity to buy that. And then we were thinking we would somehow change the alignment of the sidewalk to try and get it to be within ADA standards, right? That north side, like I said earlier, is a bit above 8%. Nothing you can really do about that. And in fact, we had to increase the vertical clearance over the interstate, right? Everything back in the day was 15 feet. Now we're 16.6. So that had to go up. So it just made it worse. Well, okay, we're going to overlay to the north here, and we've got to put this drainage system up over there, actually. So we're going to go all the way up to University with an overlay. And then finally, heck, we're just going to rebuild the whole corridor. Those that are students that are looking to get into transportation, this is pretty typical. It's and what the goal here was, again, back to what I said before, PEDs first, bikes second, mass transit third, and then the others last. A lot of the things we did were down with that intention. Sidewalks were pulled well away from the roadway. The roadway itself was narrowed way up. As our traffic folks in the room here know, when you make roadways not as wide, people drive not as fast. They don't feel as comfortable driving fast. So that's kind of in more urban areas, tighten that up. People don't feel like they can drive as fast as they won't. We're going to add lots of green spaces. So all the medians, we're going to have green spaces in it. And then again, we're still talking about that sidewalk over here to try and make that ADA compliant, and then pulling away from Tiger Jack's building right there. One thing you'll notice, the sidewalks ended up being 16 feet. And so the evolution of sidewalks is interesting on its own. Back when they built the interstate, 5 feet was kind of the standard, non-barrier separated. And then over time, that became more like 8 feet. And then in around 2000, that was 12 feet. And then we started barrier separating, putting a barrier between the pedestrians and the traffic. And up until this, 12 feet was kind of the standard. We proposed 16 feet. That was a kind of a big deal to get through the DOT. They saw it as a precedent, which is true. Other communities would look at that and go, we want that. And that's happened. The 494 design build project down on the south side through Bloomington has 3 bridges off to the east of 35W, Portland, Nicollet, and 12th. All of them have like 19-foot sidewalks, 18-foot sidewalks, 20-foot. You're going to see more and more of that. Because the fact of the matter is, after we built this, and we do have a barrier separating it, it doesn't seem excessive. It's incredibly pleasant. And if you had kids trying to cross from the south side of 94 to the north side, the signals have preemption, which or has timing that allows for the PEDs to cross before any traffic starts to move. It's incredibly safe. It feels good. It is just better. So those are some of the features that we brought into it. I'll go through some construction stuff. 94 has an incredible amount of utilities, as you can imagine. And it turns out that almost all of the internet in the cities goes through the north side of 94. There's 20 different ducts that carry fiber optic for pretty much everyone. And when we looked into it, this is where the duct was, and this is where I needed the duct to be. And so we had to work around that. Interesting note, we actually had to cut some of the fiber and move it. We were told, thou shall not do that till after the Super Bowl. Drainage infiltration in an urban area can be a big challenge, right? We have to treat stormwater. The preference is to allow for infiltration, water going back into the ground to recharge the groundwater table. We don't have room for that in urban areas. So these are 84-inch pipes that are perforated that take on that large volume of water during a storm, and then it infiltrates. And you can see the scale here. Sorry, the picture is a little fuzzy, but nonetheless, very large. When you do this, obviously you have a geo company go out and they do a boring, they tell you what they think the infiltration rate will be. But before you're allowed to install it, you actually have to run a test. And when we ran that test, it was super sandy. So it just basically the water disappeared. So it worked out great. Construction over 94 is a challenge. This is the first bridge to be reconstructed over 94 between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this is a vital corridor for us. We did build it in 2020, which was both helpful and non-helpful, right? That was the first year of COVID, so traffic was way down, but traffic was also incredibly fast. Yeah, like I said, I was one of the administration people during construction, and being down here in the pier area in between the directions of traffic was not entirely comfortable, even though we had barriers down there. So that part of it was a challenge, although not having a lot of traffic makes it easier to get lane closures. But nonetheless, we built the bridge in stages, one half and then the other half, 2 halves in a year, which in Minnesota is challenging. But we did manage to pull it off. But this is the first bridge to be placed in St. Paul, or in this segment of 94. All right, so the trees. A couple things with the trees. I thought they were really neat. I got basically a shape of it. You know, we want this tree 20 feet tall. So I kind of struggled with how to do it. And then ultimately, I think it worked out pretty well, or it seems to have been a pretty good idea, but went and met with a fabricator. All right, here's what we got. And I had an idea of basically laminating steel to create the strength. But I wasn't sure if it was entirely possible. So we went and met with a fabricator and kind of laid out our thoughts. And essentially what we wanted to do was create something that they could cut with the CNC machine and then weld together in concept, right? Laminating steel together. All in all, that works. The steel that would work, you know, like the CNC machine and just being able to handle it, they wanted to work with 4x8 sheets. That works. And then the other thing is, as a lot of people here I'm sure know, when you weld steel, obviously you superheat it, and if it's not a big enough element, it's going to start to warp. And that would be a challenge. So what we ended up doing, and you'll see it in this picture here, obviously laminated the steel, and it's sometimes when you put up with a challenge on an engineering front, the solution that you come up with is almost always obvious if it's good and relatively straightforward. And so, yeah, we laminated steel to help with the warping problem. We bolted it together. But one of the things we didn't want to do with the bolting was to create something that someone could grab onto, like a hex bolt. You can grab onto it on the nut, and it projects out. You can put your foot on it. You know, you can grab onto it. So we asked the fabricator, "Can you guys still do rivets?" And they said, "Sure." But ultimately, that's what we ended up doing. You have to pay for the steel that you bought originally, even the part that gets cut out. So we went through about 20,000 pounds of steel per tree. When they did the riveting, they actually had to get someone in that had some history with it and reteach all the crew on how to do it. But in the end, bought 20,000 pounds per tree. They weigh about 6,000 pounds. We did not want to, ultimately, if you remember in the first photo with the tree, they wanted them on the bridge, kind of going over the bridge. And one thing with bridges, which is kind of unfortunate, it's often a point where people go when they're at the end of themselves. And so but they didn't want the trees to become something people climbed up and then dropped off of. So we had to pull them off onto the side, and then getting into some funding things, they didn't want it attached to the bridge because then it's part of the bridge plan. So we actually put in separate foundations, completely independent, so it's not part of the bridge. Of all the things we did, this was arguably art. This is art. There's no way to say this is somehow just general aesthetics on a bridge. But the way it got through and the way it got ultimately approved was in the environmental document, which is something we have to do now in transportation projects, largely because of the way the interstate was built. There's a component to it, environmental justice. And I'm not an expert on these documents. I'm not the author of the one for this one, but essentially it was acknowledged of the missteps of our predecessors when they built the interstate, and that this is an acknowledgement of trying to repair that that mistake. So ultimately via that, it was able to be paid for via federal funding. A couple other things. So you can see here, we have Dale Street here, which seems like a small thing, right? Putting the name of a street on the bridge. MnDOT doesn't like doing that, but they allowed us to do it here. And actually now other places want to do it. So precedence is a problem. And unfortunately, I think this is the best picture I have of it, but you can see here where the street network is. It's also across the front of the abutment on each side. That's how the houses turned out right there. Turned out really well. There's 3 different house types that are in 6 different pilasters. You can see right here how we did the formwork for the I Am Rondo in 13 different languages. Not a great photo, but you can also see right here where it's a little less prominent. Construction doesn't always go how you want, and the form for that area was not as well punched out as the others, but you're building 2 halves of a bridge in a year, you don't have much time to stop, so we had to make do with what we had. So that's ultimately how it is now, but it turned out all right, but nothing's ever perfect. All right, remember there were oak leaves here before, that didn't work, so we did acorns. So this is polycarbonate. Acrylic, and when we started looking into how to make this happen, we first looked at steel. That had a lot of challenges with it, so we used polycarbonate. We are Rondo, the orange. This is sandwiched 3 layers of a sandwich. The black is the outside layers that had the cutout, and then the inside layer is the element, the color you can see. So one of the things you should know, I'm sure some of you are aware, AASHTO has requirements for railings, certain amount of force that they can withstand. And when we proposed this, the natural question was, how do you know this has enough capacity? So I talked to the suppliers and they said, well, because we were thinking 3/8 inch poly, and they said, well, all NHL plexiglass in the country is 1/2 inch, and we haven't actually, they've never had one fail due to a puck. So that seemed to satisfy everyone's desire if it had enough strength. So that's actually 1/2 inch polycarbonate. But you can see we put a lot of time into trying to keep things connected so that you could actually make the lettering work. This was all given to a contractor so that they can cut it out on a CNC machine. That is the poem on the bridge deck. Obviously, you see a lot of the curing compound there. That kind of goes away over time. But this is how the sandblasting turned out on the bridge deck. It turned out actually quite great. That's the final product right there. So you can see the bridge or the trees here on each side. This right here is where and that's along the face, the street network. Dale Street written here, and then the polycarbonate there. The artists were incredibly great to work with. When we did the final presentation of, you always do your final community engagement meeting, like, this is what we're going to build. Micah, one of the artists, she was kind of the central figure in that presentation. And then Micah did such a fantastic job. We brought her on during construction to help with communication. So really drawing the neighborhood in as much as we could through the artists to help facilitate the project was ultimately fundamental to the success of the job. You can see over here the wandering path to make up for the ADA component and that. And again, here are our three artists. That's my presentation. So I know it's not as academic. I looked at the list of other topics you guys have, and it's really academic. And this is not what I want to point out here, though, is that project delivery for the students, especially on the transportation end, this soft side to a project, the soft side approach is going to become a bigger and bigger component of future transportation projects. It's just going to be. The engineering for a lot of this is relatively straightforward. There's lots of challenging engineering challenges on projects, but on a lot of it, the engineering is pretty straightforward. It's this soft side stuff that is going to become dominant in the future on how to deliver a project successfully.
Questions, maybe two questions, and then if you don't mind, Matt, repeating the question as well as you can.
Yep, I'm familiar with this.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Clearly, what it ended up was not what you originally had envisioned. How did you write your project approach in your original proposal so as to get selected?
Well, I mean, so the question is, how did we write the project approach in our original proposal such that we got selected, that ultimately delivered the project that was way different than what was initial? Well, we had no idea, frankly, that this is how the project was going to go. Looking back on it, would I write that way different? Absolutely. But it required a couple of amendments along the way. Everyone was caught, frankly, unprepared for the community engagement that we ultimately had to do and what that resulted in the project as constructed. But that's also pretty common. And that's a huge challenge, actually, in transportation projects, because you have an idea of a project, in general what you want to do. Here we want to replace a bridge and improve the functionality of the interchange. But beyond that, you don't really know from where to where all the time. You don't know what the features are in the project. And that is, like I said, very common and a challenge for owners, frankly, trying to manage budget out of the gate. So one of the things we actually recommend is that you do prelim first and stop, and then do a final design contract. Go ahead.
There's kind of seeing in the future a bigger influence of this, kind of the engineering process. How do you recommend that we train our students to be prepared for that?
So the question is, I stated in the future, the soft side to project delivery has become more dominant than it has been in the past. And how do we train our future students to prepare for that? That's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure the answer to that, to be perfectly honest. A lot of it for me has been through experience. There's folks like the environmental documentation that is becoming a big part of it has been a big part, but even more that whole NEPA process. Almost everyone that I work with, both MnDOT and county and state, that specialize in that, they have a civil engineering background. Yet in our curriculum back in the day, we didn't have anything that focused on that. So I don't know the answer to that, how you would approach that. but that's not my area of specialty either. I'm a bridge engineer. At the end, I have folks on my team that specialize in that. So that's something that's a challenge for you, but you would have to coordinate with them on how to do that. But it is something that you're probably going to have to try and figure out, at least for transportation projects, right? My wife works on industrial projects. This is not any part of that. It's unique to transportation.
So with this project for the I-94, these can be transportation projects specifically. They originated as from a need to revamp the transportation system in the area, and then shifted that a little bit like a social lens through it. Do you foresee projects in the future starting out with that sort of social lens and then having the transportation in afterwards? So it's trying to like bridge the need between
The question is, this project started out with a functionality need as the purpose. But in the end, a big part of the driver of the project was based on PEDs and those accommodations. Do we see in the future projects that are a need based on pedestrian? And the answer is actually yes, and you see a lot of that now. If you think about all the trails and pedestrian bridges out there, those are driven by pedestrian need and accommodations. And actually, when you do, it's getting into the weeds a little bit. But when projects are funded, a lot of times the feds give money to the state, and the Met Council distributes the money, and they do it through an application process. You have to have a process, and a big part of that is the pedestrian need or the accommodations that your project does for pedestrians. And one thing you see is when the interstate was built, it was all utility of moving traffic. And now, one of the sole things about it is how are you making it better for pedestrians and bicycles and mass transit? So, yeah. Thank you.